Thanks, everybody, for joining me on this latest edition of At the Table. This is a special Democratic Convention preview, and we've got a terrific panel with us today. Andrea Mitchell of NBC News and MSNBC, Ed O'Keefe from CBS News, and Ted Johnson, Deadline.com. Let me just quickly set it up. We're taping on Thursday, a few days before the kickoff. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden just did their first joint appearance in a rally in Maryland that kind of looked like a campaign rally, part tribute to Biden. So, Ed, let me start out with you to kind of set the stage. What does the vice president have to do with this conversation at this convention to keep the conversation going that she's been able to command so far?
Well, she's got to take the country's and the world's attention to her advantage and really, in essence, reintroduce herself to people who know her as the running mate, but really don't know that much about her or may not recall the details from 4 years ago. Remember, she was a candidate who dropped out before 2020 even began. She was chosen after a pretty high stakes vice presidential search of Joe Biden's own. But, that happened in the midst of a pandemic when a lot of people were more distracted justifiably by all of that and maybe haven't paid as much attention to what she was doing. And then, of course, she was saddled in the early years of her vice presidency by the pandemic, couldn't travel the country, had to be in Washington to not only deal with government operations, but to break ties in the Senate, and didn't get to travel and introduce herself in that way. And now, with only about 100 days until Election Day, gets thrown into the election as the nominee and has to spend these closing weeks introducing or reintroducing herself, explaining how she's going to be like Joe Biden, be different than Joe Biden, be more liberal or moderate than him, and also introduce her running mate and assuage any concerns people have that she can do the job.
So, Andrea, you have covered many conventions. The most obvious thing that's different here is that we have a candidate, the nominee, who didn't exist a few weeks ago.
Right.
As you go into this, what is the particular challenge that you think the vice president has to make this a maximum opportunity for herself?
Well, she's got the stage, and she's done really well, almost flawlessly in the first 3 weeks. She had such a compressed cycle, 3 weeks, and only a week and a half as we speak since she chose her vice president. So none of that, the vetting, everything else that is done, the big speech she's going to give on Thursday night at the convention, they work months on that traditionally. I've covered every convention except one convention in 1 year since 1972. So I've seen the protests in Miami, went through all of that. My first conventions were Miami, when everyone was protesting against Richard Nixon in Miami, and I was tear gassed. I was a young reporter, obviously. Then 76 in Kansas City. In all of those conventions, in not, of course, 68 in Chicago, which was the big one, there were a lot of political cross currents. There were the protests outside, but this could be really great turmoil outside on the streets. We were involved in, two wars, one that is, gripping the Democratic Party. She has to define her foreign policy and figure out how to be loyal to the legacy of Joe Biden, who will have his great moment on Monday night, but then will, as they say in Shakespeare, exeunt, off stage and not be seen again. So that is going to be gracious, but thank you very much, Joe Biden. We want to focus on the younger, newer, more exciting candidate that we've now nominated. Not to put too fine a point on it, it's awkward. And at this point, she is taking center stage and has to figure out a way to define herself, as Ed says, but not be ungracious to the large number of delegates who are really loyal to Joe Biden. This is a Democratic convention, largely made up of people who are loyal to Biden. And this is the party base, not the young people, not the people who are, except for the uncommitted delegates, the people upset about the war. And she has to not offend all of them while building on that base and defining herself without being disloyal. That's hard. But so far, her choreography, her orchestration has been great. Now let's see how she fills in the gaps beyond the personality, beyond the great contrast in terms of age and gender that she shows to Donald Trump, and of course Tim Walz to J.D. Vance. How
So,
do they show these hard distinctions without being considered an ingrate?
so you have a good point. The delegates stood solid during the period where Biden was being pressured by party leaders to step aside. But of the head spinning events that have taken place is the suddenness and how Harris was able to nail down the nomination. Ted, the other thing that happened in the turnaround was that the money spigot that was drying up for Biden opened up again, and you covered closely Hollywood money, writing for Deadline, and George Clooney, who hosted a mega fundraiser for Biden a few weeks later, then wrote an influential op-ed that he was done. So I sometimes think that donors are a barometer, not the end all. What's your analysis of the donor community and, frankly, the Hollywood entertainment community?
Well, there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm for the Harris-Walz ticket. Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, was just in Hollywood for a fundraiser. A lot of enthusiasm there. It sold out. It got a few stars there to show up. But that said, there is what I'm hearing is there's something in the works for next month, more of a bigger event that would feature Vice President Harris and intended as kind of a show of unity, that despite this big discord that took place in July when George Clooney wrote the op-ed, and a number of other industry donors and donors overall really demanded that the ticket be changed or they're going to withhold their money, that this is being looked upon as, hey, we're all united. Let bygones be bygones, and let's just move forward. So I think it's also interesting, and we might see some of this at the convention next week, that Harris has always been a little closer to the entertainment community than Joe Biden has been, by mere fact that she is a senator from that state, attorney general from that state, but also Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, is he is a former entertainment attorney. He still teaches at Georgetown. And so he has those connections as well. So you'll see some of that deployed, I think, next week in various ways.
So when we're talking about stars now, the political stars of the Democratic Party will be at the convention. Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton. We're waiting to see if Michelle Obama will be there. So these, and I'm not even getting into Governor Walz yet or Kamala Harris. So, Ed, in your analysis, what is the impact of just the speakers at the convention? After all, what is unusual in this is that Harris is already nominated.
I appreciate that you're asking me the question about stars when I'm sitting in a planetarium. That's good of you. And to Ted's earlier point about Doug Emhoff, Ted probably can appreciate this story. Andrea would be familiar with this maybe too, that every year, the night before the Correspondents' Dinner in Washington, the two big Hollywood agencies, Creative Artists and United Talent, hold separate parties, and Emhoff shows up for them. And he sort of stands there and at one point said to me a few years ago, "These are my people. This is my base," because he used to cut deals with these people back in the day in Hollywood. I mean, he really is naturally comfortable and accustomed to being in those kinds of settings. So the ability for him to help bring in money is going to be profound. But for next week, look, I think one of the practical things, Lynn, is when it comes to how we cover these events, and I think Andrea can speak to this too, there are more people whose speeches we are keen to take uninterrupted from the beginning to end, because these are people who have been president, can move votes, can move elements of the Democratic Party, and who demonstrate that the entire Democratic Party apparatus is behind her, despite the chaos and the unexpected nature of the campaign she's now running, versus a few weeks ago in Milwaukee, where every night was the Donald Trump show, and there were very few other Republican leaders who aren't aligned with him or who have any ties to the last Republican presidency, George W. Bush, who were even invited or allowed to be there. So the cast of characters, the diversity of that, the history of seeing the Clintons and the Obamas there to back her up, plus the tribute Monday night to Joe Biden, is in and of itself interesting and therefore newsworthy for those of us who cover politics. And it's going to mean more sustained coverage, most likely, of what it is they're doing.
And again, a convention is a 4-night show. But Andrea, okay, so there's giddy enthusiasm, even euphoria among Democrats right now. Harris hasn't done it. Has launched herself perfectly. The complaints of Trump that she hasn't done a press conference. As a reporter, I have to speak them and said, yeah, she should have done it, but she's doing okay without it. But we have some clouds on the horizon right now, and who knows what could happen next week. So pretty serious stuff going on in the world. What, is going, if you, could you analyze the wars we're in with Russia and the ongoing war in Gaza and the status of ceasefire talks that may or may not make movements next week? How do these clouds, do you think, factor into what otherwise is this giddy euphoria going on within the party faithful?
Well, the big deal is the lack of a ceasefire deal and hostage release. There was a chance, it was back in May when Joe Biden unveiled what he said was an Israeli and U.S. blessed proposal. And ever since then, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been dragging his feet both publicly and privately to the point where his own defense minister has criticized him for, he says, prolonging the war long beyond the necessary point of attack in Gaza. There have been more and more civilian deaths. Israel has yet to explain it. So even though Hamas started this and could release the hostages at any moment, John Kirby has acknowledged to me in an interview that the clouds hanging over any chance of getting a hostage deal do include, as we speak today, the threat of an Iranian retaliation. They still expect it, despite a lot of diplomatic pressure and military buildup from the U.S. side to try to deter it, prevent it, or minimize it. They expect that cloud over any kind of agreement, as well as the obstacles that U.S. officials acknowledge have been thrown up in front of the deal being finalized, primarily by Netanyahu and the very hard right ministers in his coalition that are keeping him in government. And I can't speak to his motivation, but they're now saying this. And they're not even suggesting that this negotiation, these couple of days of negotiation in Qatar going into the convention, are going to produce the deal. So that means there will be protesters. There will be protesters returning in the fall to the campuses. You've seen the resignation now of the Columbia president. That's the third Ivy League president who's fallen victim to the stress within the largely liberal wing of the party. There are threats and real concerns about anti-Semitism. Doug Mhof, whom you just referred to as a big asset in Hollywood, is a huge asset as he campaigns now around the world, in Paris during the Olympics, against anti-Semitism. Kamala Harris's Jewish and very observant husband. That said, these are stresses in the coalition that normally elects a president. Now, Minnesota is not a big challenge necessarily, but Michigan is, and Michigan has a large Arab American community, as does the Muslim community, of course, in Minnesota, most largely Somali. But in Michigan, it's a big factor, potentially. It's a disruptive factor, certainly. And it's a loud factor. And these are people, as Kamala Harris said to one protest group during a rally, if you care about defeating Donald Trump, then you'll get your turn, but this is my turn. Well, that's what's on the line. In a closely fought election, despite the potential sugar high of the trends in the polls, it's still within the margin of error. The battlegrounds are still tight. There is the fear of election interference, the machinations in Georgia and other states already at the local level. So these are concerns, and they know that they have to win decisively, or else the challenges are going to become, again, a potential threat. Donald Trump has put it out there that he'll accept the results if he wins, basically.
So, Ed, I think you have to leave in a few minutes. If that's still true, I want to give you the next question, and then I'll continue with Andrea and Ted.
Sure.
So I'll get back to everybody, but in the few minutes remaining with Ed O'Keefe at CBS, how does Trump stop the runaway Harris train?
Well, every Republican tells him if you would just focus on policy, and stop making it so personal. It would remind voters that he's in better position to handle the economy and immigration, which remain top of mind concerns for most voters. And in polling consistently for the past year, he has been on top on those two issues. But his biggest drawback is the fact that he continues to make things so personal and so nasty. And they know, his team does, and it's pretty clear from polling and reporting we do and conversations with voters, that that kind of personal attack just doesn't fly with voters anymore. They don't want to hear that from him. They've heard 8 years of it from him, frankly. So bringing on a handful of people who worked with him in 2016 and in 2020, who know how to maybe refocus him, or to how to keep the entire campaign focused on those big issues of the economy and inflation and immigration, might be able to keep him somewhat stabilized. But the real sense of dread and concern, not panic, because there's still 80 plus days, but concern is such that he's bringing in a handful of people who've worked with him in the past and who know how to talk to him and know how to refocus him, appears designed to, hopefully, in their view, get him back to just focusing on the issues and being the more disciplined candidate he was being through much of the spring, in part because he had to sit in courtrooms, but also through the early summer in the midst of Biden's troubles, where sometimes a little less was a lot more for him, in that it kept him in the lead. We'll see. And it'll be most interesting to see how he responds next week as he watches his former foes, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and his new one, Kamala Harris, stand there and accept the nomination and capture the world's attention.
Thank you, Ed O'Keefe, who has to do some stargazing at Chicago's planetarium. Thanks for joining us.
Something like that.
Staying with me, Andrea Mitchell of NBC News and MSNBC, and Ted Johnson of Deadline. So Ted, you're an expert also of how the media covers conventions. We are expecting in Chicago and making a lot of plans for covering protests, mainly pro-Palestinian protests. Do you see this from what you know of how networks cover conventions and what will be happening? Is this going to be the primetime shot, a split screen in your analysis?
Well, it could be, definitely. I think that I'm told there's about 15,000 journalists who are going to be there at the convention. So they, kind of there are a lot of different storylines for next week, and there's a lot at stake for the Harris campaign. But this convention has a presidential nominee and a vice presidential nominee. And I think the Democratic National Committee is going to want to project this kind of celebratory atmosphere throughout the week. So I think a lot of reporters, myself included, are going to be looking for news stories. And to the extent that protests are always a factor of conventions, I don't think there'll be any want of coverage for whoever is out there.
Okay, you always watch numbers, Ted. However millions watch the Republican convention, do you think, just if nothing else, because of the name brand speakers, will there be more for the Democratic convention? More people tuning in, do you think? On real-time TV?
Yeah, I would be surprised if there aren't as many people tuning in as the Republican convention. There was the advantage of the Trump, timed it so the vice presidential pick came right as the convention was starting. So a lot of people were just getting introduced.
He had the assassination attempt too.
And the assassination attempt. The highest rated night of the week was Thursday night. No surprise there when he gave his first major speech after that happened.
So, Andrea, of all the conventions you have watched, what do you think are some of the dramatic points or the high points or the inflections that you look for when you cover a convention?
Well, the personal side of these candidates as they flesh out their biographies, and it's so important in this case. In Madison Square Garden in '92, after Bill Clinton had a very rocky primary season, to say the least, he and his wife and daughter Chelsea, walking, through the streets into Madison Square Garden and appearing on stage early. I think it was the first night of the convention.
Oh, it was the walk from Macy's, that famous walk.
The walk from Henry Square. And then the excitement coming out of the conventions, and they may be trying to mimic this a bit. They're going to do a Pennsylvania bus
trip.
Bus trip. I was
Buddy.
on all the bus trips across the country.
Right,
We
the
did
double
not have
dates.
comms the way we did back. I mean, now that we have cell phones and laptops and all, so we carried our portable typewriters. There were 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 press buses after the Clintons and Gores, and that was a generational shift, and the first, post-war generation, boomers. And we went down the Jersey Highway, and we followed in an NBC Winnebago, and I would get off the bus at some point, jump on the Winnebago, start editing my story with a tape editor. We couldn't stream live, so we had to stop and then drop off after nightly news, or drop off to do nightly news. The bus would go on. We would do nightly news live from some location along the highway, a shopping center, a mall, and then jump back in the Winnebago and rush to catch up with the buses to do the Today Show live, and then pick it up there. And we were, by the way, OSHA would be shocked. We were sitting in folding chairs going across the country in an NBC Winnebago, rocking back and forth. They were not locked down, editing spots, and then trying to dial up Basie's computers on the road with dial-up cell phone. I mean, it was insane. And the fact that it is so easy now with laptops and all of our technology, but it's still hard to get to the guts of the campaign. But the color of that, everybody until then had campaigned airport to airport hangar, tarmac to tarmac. This was going across the country. Bill Clinton would stop at a crossroads. If he saw some, 12 people coming out of a bar in Iowa, literally at 2 a.m, he would stop to chat, and we would all jump off the bus and try to get up close. You would talk to voters. It was not controlled. There weren't wranglers. I mean, it was completely accessible, and it was the best campaign I've ever covered. That was post-convention, but it was sort of a continuation of the convention. Hillary Clinton memorably tried to do that in Philadelphia, coming out of her convention, and go across Pennsylvania in 2016. And it was a terrible flop because she only would stop 1 time a day, and the crowds were slim, and it was a great test of the comparison between what had happened in 92 and what happened to her in her general election. So I want to see this time how better organized are they or not? How do they interact with crowds? Pennsylvania is the be all and end all of the battlegrounds as far as I'm
Pennsylvania, that on it. So I would imagine that.
And one other thing, the Reagan convention in Dallas was really great when he came up live on the screen. You were there, Lynn, I think, and Nancy.
Not at that one.
Yeah. And then when he came out after his Alzheimer's, affliction, the diagnosis, and she came out and spoke. I mean, the first ladies have been extraordinary. Obviously Michelle Obama, and we never saw Melania other than standing in the family box. So I just want to see.
He never talked at the Republican convention, but no. I cannot imagine we're not going to hear from. I know Doug Mhof has a speech. I would imagine we'll hear from his wife, who I don't know at all. By the way, you gave me a little walk down memory lane. My first convention was 1992 at that Clinton convention, Madison Square Garden. And to people who are listening, if you're in Chicago and you can figure out any way to at least partake of the convention, know somebody who could get you into the United Center for a few minutes. There's activities at McCormick Place. But for me, my first I had been to Houston right before that, but the real exuberance and the buzz of going into a bedecked convention hall, and I've been to a lot since then, but I remember that the most. And you just gave me a flashback as the confetti's going down in Madison Square Garden. Do you remember Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac were playing Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow?
Can I just give you one little personal memory? I mean, there was, of course, the drama of Sarah Palin, and that was St. Paul, Minnesota. And of course, that was the high of her rollout, but that didn't last that long. But on that night when they were plastic confetti, and I must have had my mouth open, I was talking, I was on the floor, I got a plastic piece of confetti caught in my throat, live on television. And I was standing next to Maria Shriver, who was our podium correspondent, and I was choking on the convention floor. But the funniest sort of crazy one was in St. Paul when the balloon drop happened. I think of myself as a tall person. I'm very short. And I'm on the convention floor. The balloons come down. Brokaw and Russert are in the anchor booth. And, you know, the late, great Tim Russert, my mentor, and they come to me and they can't even see me. And I'm trying to bounce the balloons and pop them up so that I can stick my head up above them. And Brokaw says, now we go to Andrea Boom Boom Mitchell on the convention floor as I'm playing, you know, volleyball, but not Olympic volleyball with balloons and virtually smothering. So it
Well,
could be a floor reporter.
So I met Ted Johnson at the Obama convention in Denver in 2008. We were in the same hotel in Cherry Creek. And Ted, as you cover conventions, when you're in Chicago from your specialty beat, what will you be looking for?
Well, obviously, one of the bigger questions is, does Beyonce show up? She's doing the campaign theme.
Right. Andrea, stop everything. Now we know.
Yes.
What about opera? Oprah, rather.
Yeah. And so, you know, I do think that, you know, how they use celebrities, there is a risk of overdoing it. That was one of the knocks on the Clinton campaign, is that it just was a little too much, even at the convention, but certainly on, you know, campaigning in Pennsylvania. And I think there's this kind of euphoria in the campaign right now, and freedom. Beyonce's song kind of really has helped with the vibes, so to speak. But it would be kind of taking a page out of Bill Clinton in '92 to get Beyonce there in the same way that he got Fleetwood Mac there at the final night of the convention. You can kind of go all out, I think, on the final day. After all, Trump had Hulk Hogan and Ted Nugent at his final night. I think the use of celebrities probably right at that moment isn't so much of a concern as it is maybe other parts of the week.
I think there'll be less testosterone at this convention.
Yes.
One of the things I remember so vividly from the Hillary Clinton convention is how much she leaned on the thought of breaking the glass ceiling. And it will be interesting to see how much Kamala Harris leans on that or uses. I mean that was part. You know, that was the raison d'etre of so much of what was being talked about. And I remember there were signs at Hillary Clinton's convention that said her history on it. And it will be interesting as we are in our closing minutes here to see how they play it. Is this a history-making candidacy? I mean, just think, you will have the nation's first Black president standing in a podium a few blocks from where he started his political career, handing the baton to the candidate who could possibly be the second. You'll have Hillary Clinton, and indulge me when I do a little Chicago thing, born in Chicago, grew up in a suburb, not that far from where I live, but I came up in the city. Okay, she is the candidate who tried and failed to break the glass ceiling. And then you have Michelle Obama, if she speaks, talking what it may mean to be a Black woman looking at another Black woman becoming president, speaking a few blocks from where she was raised in a tiny apartment on the south side of Chicago. And then one of the things I'm looking forward to see if Bill Clinton reprises his role as the explainer in chief, because that's where he was it 2012 where he did that knockout role on that. But
Yeah.
Andrea, do you have a last thought on the biggest story you would like to get next week? And then Ted, and I'll see if I could think of one too before we say goodbye.
I'm actually going to have to sign off.
Okay, then Ted, you go first. Oh yes, sorry.
Oh yeah, just to catch an interview, but thank you so much, and see you in Chicago.
Okay, Ted, thank you. And okay, Andrea, I don't want to keep you. I see we're slopping over a few minutes. Unless you had a final thought, I just want to thank Ted. Did you?
The final thought was that, you know, Hillary Clinton's election night was at the Javits Center under a glass ceiling deliberately. That was part of the choreography, and we know how badly that turned out with a lot of tears. So metaphors are great. history making is great. They've got to deliver the votes. They've got to count the returns. They've got to make this election work for them. And that means a lot of hard work on the ground and a lot of lawyering, I'm afraid, by teams of lawyers on the election count process.
You have a point, as they say, measure twice, cut once. So leave no air. Andrea Mitchell, thank you for joining me in our Democratic Convention preview show, and thank Ed O'Keefe from CBS, who had been with us, Ted Johnson of Deadline, and of course, Andrea Mitchell, NBC and MSNBC. See you in Chicago. Everyone out there, thanks for joining At the Table.